sees a huge number of concurrent strikes. Nurses, railway workers, cleaners, bus drivers, posties, paramedics, porters, border force and more. All of these strikers are experiencing what most British workers are experiencing: real terms pay cuts over the past decade and a half, as inflation grows and working conditions get worse, with longer hours, less breaks and more work to do. To spell it out clearly, if inflation is 10% and your employer offers you a 3% pay rise for the year, you are taking a 7% pay cut. If you are forced to work longer hours or take fewer breaks compared to last year, with no increased compensation, you are taking a pay cut. If you must work in conditions without enough staff, without proper equipment, and while tired, you are risking your health or even your life for your employer and the safety of those who use your services. The government's response has been to threaten to use the army to scab and introducing more and harsher restrictive laws around people's rights to protest and to strike. We stand in full solidarity with all the striking workers. All they are asking for is to be able to work in a safe and dignified manner and receive enough for their labour to provide a decent life for themselves and their families. This basic demand is denied to them, as it is denied to many, many other workers in Britain and around the world. This winter, the state broadcaster, the BBC, has busied itself publishing articles such as energy saving tips, 5 ways to cut costs this winter, Christmas dinner hacks to reduce your energy spend, and a radio clip on how to keep warm on a budget. The BBC claims that energy bills have been rising for households across Europe as prices have been driven up by worries about gas and oil supplies after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Energy companies have been so worried that BP, for example, made $7.1 billion between July and September, which was more than double its profit for the same period last year. It had made $6.9 billion in the 3 months to June. Shell announced worldwide profits of $8.2 billion and $9 billion for the same 3-month periods. The British government has introduced a windfall tax on energy companies that will apparently raise $5 billion a year. The total support for energy costs is expected to cost the government $43.2 billion this year, with around half of that being used to help individuals cover the cost of their energy bills. This means that up to $38.2 billion will be going from the taxpayer to private energy companies to cover this crisis. However, Shell is not going to pay any windfall tax at all this year, as its investments in the North Sea meant it did not count as having made any profits. BP is only going to pay $678 million in windfall tax this year. This doesn't include some $6.5 billion spent on the bailout of the private energy company Bulb, costing around £200 per household in Britain. Bulb was quickly sold off to Octopus in a deal so suspect that it prompted a legal challenge from other energy companies. The energy market is yet another place that privatisation has introduced rampant speculation simply for the chance to make greater profits. A price I'm sure we can all agree was worth paying as we shiver this winter. So, record profits for some and the redistribution of individual wealth to private companies for the rest of us. To private companies that bought up publicly owned assets at a steep discount or are selling services to the taxpayer at a huge markup. And then they tell you that communists will take all your stuff. Jeremy Hunt told us the solution is to use less energy to send a message to Putin. Similarly, Nadhim Zahawi, chair of the Conservative Party, said that nurses should drop their demands to be paid a living wage, also to send a message to Putin. While European prices for electricity increased from 16 to 24 pence per kilowatt hour, British prices increased from 19 pence to 55 pence per kilowatt hour from October 2020 to June 2021. Gas prices had already begun to accelerate much more in Britain than in Europe long before the conflict in Ukraine broke out. I think the message, not to Putin, but to the working class of Britain, is quite clear. We live in a system that doesn't work, and we are governed by people that do not care about us. Going hungry has never been a concern for them. They don't have to wait years on a waiting list for an operation. They don't live in a mouldy flat that they can't afford to heat. The only interest they have is making shareholders wealthier. This winter, our ruling class wants you to be afraid. It wants you to be afraid of going cold while energy companies post record profits. It wants you to be afraid of losing your job while paying you less and less. It wants you to be afraid of war while it pours weapons into the hands of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. This winter, you should make them afraid. They should be afraid of you when you protest in the streets. They should be afraid of you when you organise and strike. They should be afraid of you when you demand peace and not war. Everything you want and need from life is anathema to the ruling class. I will now read to you our party's manifesto for the crisis, before discussing a little bit more in depth what exactly an economic crisis is, how and why it occurs, and if they can be prevented or stopped. The Communist Manifesto for the Crisis. Following the pandemic, the whole world is finding itself in a situation of economic chaos. Living standards of working people are falling precipitously almost everywhere in the world. Countries such as Lebanon, Sri Lanka, Pakistan and Ghana are already bankrupt and unable to purchase essentials needed by their populations, medicine, food and energy especially. In Britain, things are also very bad, although not as bad as they are in most countries of the world. Prices have gone through the roof, while wages, even in a time of relatively full employment, are in no way keeping up with inflation. The government is reducing expenditure on public services in order to reduce its borrowing requirements, while simultaneously increasing taxation on the working population. At the same time, it is spending outrageous amounts on armaments, on supporting war in Ukraine against Russia, and on various military provocations around the globe. Nor is it prepared very easily to impose a wealth tax on the multi-billionaires, that is the bourgeoisie of the world, who are actually still enriching themselves to the tune of several billions a year, while ordinary people, the proletariat, are being systematically pushed lower and lower into poverty and destitution. What must now surely be obvious is that the economic system, capitalism, which dominates the world, is absolutely not fit for purpose. Despite the human ability to produce more and more with less and less effort, the vast majority of people are seeing a drastic fall in their living standards, and all because the capitalist mode of production has a fundamental design fault that periodically causes it to stall simply because it has produced infinitely more than people, and governments on their behalf, can afford to buy. In these periods of crisis, people go hungry because they have produced too much, and the markets are flooded, and the capitalists can't make a profit. So living standards plunge as the capitalists try to rescue themselves at the expense of the working masses. So desperate is this situation that the leading imperialist countries are driven to war to try to secure advantages they can no longer hope to gain by peaceful means. This is why the US, with the backing of European countries through the NATO alliance, has been threatening Russia in order to be able to dominate it, moving vast amounts of weaponry into Ukraine and nurturing a fascist movement in the country to use against Russian interests. And it is why Russia has been fighting back. The bill for all the armaments and weaponry being supplied by the UK to the Ukrainian fascists is presented for payment to the British taxpayer, while the billionaire owners of the armaments industry get even richer. Similarly aggressive moves are being made by NATO against China, very much risking a conflagration over Taiwan that will again cost a fortune in treasure and in lives. The aggression against Russia and China, both of which are in possession of very advanced weaponry that they have independently developed, in both cases purely for the purpose of defending themselves against NATO expansionist ambition, rather than for the purpose of aggression against anyone at all, risks plunging the world into a Third World War. A war which will not leave North America and Europe unscathed, but runs a very real risk of the kind of damage being inflicted on our cities, towns and infrastructure that North America and Europe have unleashed on defenceless countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yugoslavia, etc. We could soon be seeing our historical buildings smashed to smithereens, our supplies of water, electricity and gas destroyed, our sewers blown up. Is that what we want? Clearly not. But how do we stop it? Once we understand that the real cause of the problem is the unavoidability of ever worsening periodic crisis and war for as long as capitalism continues to be the economic system that dominates the world, then the solution begins to be obvious. When it is further understood that this economic system remains in use despite its lethal flaws because there is a tiny minority of billionaires in the world who benefit from it, whose private wealth and control over the world's means of production and financial system provide them with the leverage to dictate terms to governments, be they democratically elected or not. We cannot but realise that this tiny minority of people have to be dispossessed and overthrown so that we can get rid of the capitalist system and replace it with a system of rational planning of deployment of the means of production to meet the needs of the people who do the producing. Because of the vast wealth at their command, this tiny minority of billionaires have at their disposal a massive propaganda machine. Media, educational institutions of every kind, etc. Plus armies of bureaucrats, government officials, to say nothing of the means of coercing people by violence to submit to their requirements through deployment of the army, the police and the judicial system. It will therefore be no easy task to dislodge them in order to establish public ownership of the means of production and central planning of production for the benefit of the producers to replace the blind turmoil of the market. The resistance unleashed by the billionaire class, the bourgeoisie, will be massive, cruel, unprincipled and inhuman. Nevertheless, it is the destiny of the working class, that is everybody who depends for a decent livelihood on getting and keeping a job, to overcome the violence of the state machine wielded by and on behalf of the super rich, and set up their own working class, proletarian state to ensure that an economic system is installed to replace capitalism, a socialist economic system that is not geared to private profit, but to the ever greater satisfaction of the needs of the people. The Soviet working class and peasantry established a communist state in 1917, which it was able to do because it rallied behind the leadership of their Communist Party. After the communist state was established, the powerful capitalists of the world moved heaven and earth to try to smash it, by military intervention first, and then by economic sanctions, massive assistance to distance to sabotage and destroy, and then through World War. All steps taken by the working class state to defend itself against these attacks were portrayed in all the world bourgeois propaganda media as vicious totalitarianism, in order to give the workers of the world the idea that, terrible though their conditions were under capitalism, communism would be even worse. Nevertheless, when the capitalist world was enveloped in the depression of the 1930s, that spread utter misery and want throughout the working class population of all capitalist countries, the Soviet economy was going from strength to strength, with full employment and a high level of education and health provision available to all. This is what communists are trying to achieve. However, unless millions of people actively support them, communists by themselves can achieve nothing. And in countries such as Britain, whose finance kings are extracting extraordinarily large amounts of profit from the Third World by lending them money that they can never repay at high rates of interest, the ruling class has been able to afford to buy off proletarian revolution by the oppressed and exploited, by making such concessions as offering free education and healthcare, as well as a minimum level of welfare and pensions. As a result, they have made the lot of the working class masses more bearable, while at the same time deluging them with anti-communist propaganda to impart the illusion that there is no point in going through all the trauma and chaos of a revolution, because any communist state that emerged would be even worse than the worst that capitalism can provide. In addition, the first communist country, the Soviet Union, succumbed to the pressure put on it by the enemies of working class power. She had, during the Second World War, lost 27 million people, a disproportionate number of whom would have been among the best of the country's communists, bound as they must always be to take the lead in fighting the forces of darkness. Some people whose Soviet education had enabled them to rise to leading and responsible positions in society began to envy the ostentatious wealth that their social counterparts in capitalist countries were able to accumulate. Young people who had only ever known a communist society began to resent the restrictions that the USSR's hostile environment forced it to maintain. In the ideologically weakened Communist Party, these tendencies made themselves felt to the point that the party leadership was able, in the name of bringing Marxism-Leninism up to date, to unleash a plan gradually to restore capitalism, by restoring the market and profitability to the position of decisive elements for determining what should be produced in terms of goods and services, and how and to whom it should be distributed. As the supposedly socialist market took over, the power of the masses of the people to influence production and distribution decisions through representations to the Planning Commission was gradually eroded, producing the cynicism among the masses that is typical in capitalist countries. Except that, since it was all happening in the name of Marxism-Leninism, the disillusion came to be aimed at communism itself. It was in these circumstances that the working class was ousted from power in the Soviet Union, with millions, including those who may have even supported the overthrow of socialism, nevertheless finding themselves either jobless or demoted, thrown out of their homes, bereft of any form of social security. Elderly people trying to sell their few possessions in order to survive became a common sight. Russian prostitutes became a phenomenon all over the world, wherever there were tourists. Life expectancy plummeted by 10 years. Eventually, under the leadership of Vladimir Putin, a stop was put to the worst of the rot, and the workers were able to derive some benefit at least from the high price of oil, gas, and other commodities. They still have not, however, regained state power or been able to restore socialism. It should be easy for the masses of humanity to rid itself of a defective economic system installed purely for the benefit of 0.1% of the population. But of course, if it were easy in reality, then it would have already happened. Angry people often riot in protest at inhuman demands made of them and outrageous injustices committed against them. But the riots rarely bring about any improvement in the situation, or at least none that is long-lasting. Those who lead the riots are forced to pay a heavy price in terms of prison sentences and ongoing punishment thereafter, while the perpetrators of people's anger are left to gloat and wag a sorrowful finger at those who dared rise against them. For people's rage and anger to bring about the changes in society that are needed to free it from the irrationalities of capitalism, what is needed is a leadership body, the Communist Party, that knows both what needs to be achieved and what needs to be done in order to achieve it. And that party needs to have the trust of the people, so that they are willing to follow its lead. If we look around the capitalist world today, and particularly if we look at the situation in Britain, one is hard put to identify any communist movement that inspires any confidence in its ability to lead a revolution, to put an end to capitalism, and to establish a socialist planned economy. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the communist movement can only be described as being in a sorry mess, stacked up with communists who have actually given up on proletarian revolution and have resigned themselves to joining pleas to the capitalists and their governments that they should try to be a bit less mean. Because they do tend to have a smattering of Marxist understanding, they realise that the major problems in the world are caused by the persistent reign of capitalism, which they are generally happily to roundly denounce. But they feel totally helpless to do anything other than beg, and they pass on that weakness and helplessness to the working class people at large. It follows that what the communist movement needs is revitalisation. To start with, those who are already in the movement need to study the setbacks it has received in particular, though by no means exclusively the collapse of the Soviet Union, in order to understand what mistakes were made and how those mistakes will be avoided in the future. It is essential to grasp the fact that in no way do those defeats signify that Marxism-Leninism is at fault, but they are universally the result of departure from Marxism-Leninism. They must regain confidence in their ultimate destination, a society where a centralised planned economy has replaced capitalism and where production is not for profit but for the maximum satisfaction of the needs of the masses, be they physical, for example food, clothing, shelter and medical provision, cultural, for example education, research, sport, literature, art and music, or spiritual, for example entertainment and encouragement to aim high. They must break with their infatuation with bourgeois elections and remember that the only point of participating in them is to expose their fraudulent nature in practice in the eyes of those who the bourgeoisie seeks to deceive. They must recall again Marx's watchword to the effect that workers should not be inscribing on their banners only a demand for higher wages, but should be demanding that the wages system be brought altogether to an end. All energetic, class-conscious workers need to devote time and energy to building and strengthening a worthy Communist Party. No more sitting around in organisations wedded to parliamentarianism and the return of left-leaning MPs, and or which devote themselves to parroting the lies that the bourgeoisie tells about the states where the working class has in the past taken power under the leadership of its Communist Party. We in the CPGBML believe that our party is a proper Marxist-Leninist party that is worth joining and supporting, that offers Marxist-Leninist training to anybody who wants to make themselves fit to serve the people. At the present time, our party is not strong enough to offer effective leadership to a revolutionary movement of the masses. But given the vicious blows that the bourgeoisie is preparing to deliver to the living standards of the masses, as well as their war preparations for World War III against Russia and China, it is urgent that anybody who can should add their weight to improving our ability to reach the masses, to spread the understanding that they do have the power to overturn the rule of the 0.1%, and to install an economic system capable of providing to their needs. Don't sit on your hands. Don't fiddle while Rome burns. Your class needs you. The future of humanity needs you. Step forward to help make history. So, now hearing from our manifesto for the crisis, we're going to look a little bit more about what actually is an economic crisis and what causes it. Regular, periodic crises have been an inherent feature of capitalism since the early 19th century, when large-scale mechanised industry was introduced. Capitalist crises are crises of overproduction. What does this mean, a crisis of overproduction? It means that too many goods have been produced, more than can be sold. Because the only aim of a capitalist is to generate more and more profit, and to do that they must produce and sell more and more commodities, they produce as many as possible. But it's not up to them who buys the goods they produce, or for what price. They have to sell their goods in the anarchy of the marketplace, and if this cannot be achieved, they will suffer economically or go bankrupt. This leads to mass layoffs and a knock-on effect whereby their former employees no longer receive a wage to buy commodities from other capitalists, pay their rent or mortgage, etc. It also means that the capitalist cannot pay their debts, is no longer buying materials and machinery, or paying for energy use. What began as overproduction of, for example, cars, now leads to other producers going bust. The whole economic system begins to convulse, not because it is starved of material, or labour, or social need for certain things, but because there were too many things. Banks begin to panic, money is printed, and inflation begins, compounding the situation. During the 2008 crisis, inflation reached around 5%. In 2022, inflation is over 10% and climbing. While you suffer during this most recent crisis, however, don't be misled into thinking the crisis is bad for everyone. The few capitalists who are positioned well enough to take advantage of a crisis make the most of the opportunity. They buy out bankrupted individuals, acquiring their assets at a bargain rate. During the COVID pandemic, which masked the onset of this present crisis with lockdowns and government support schemes, the world's richest people got about $2 trillion richer. Between April and June 2020, billionaires managed to increase their collective wealth by 27.5% during the 4-month period. And the only way they could increase their wealth like that is by draining it from the rest of the world, from the working class, from non-millionaires. Banks have been buying up properties from landlords that have gone bankrupt. Lloyds Banking Group, which was bailed out by taxpayers in 2009, is planning on becoming the country's largest private landlord with 50,000 properties by the year 2030. These astonishing figures and astonishing sums of money highlight the crucial contradiction in capitalism. Work is socialised. That is, the working class collaborates in society to produce items that fulfil wants and needs. But control over production is privatised. That is, a tiny minority of individuals, the ultra-wealthy, appropriate the products of this social labour for themselves. Not only that, they are on a kamikaze mission to increase their own wealth at all costs, and direct the entirety of society, which they essentially own, to this end. Instead of producing to meet the needs of society, food, clothing, housing, education, entertainment, art, etc., they produce entirely haphazardly, in a completely irrational way. The capitalist society is one of unplanned production. That is, these private individuals that have appropriated the wealth of society decide to produce items that they think will make them the most profit, not what is based on the needs of society. In a planned society, it is carefully and rationally analysed what society needs, what people want, and production is planned according to those needs and wants, rather than the other way around. Production carries on and people demand is generated or attempts to be generated until it comes to a point where too many things have been produced by certain producers and they can't sell them anymore. There are some solutions proposed to this, for example, raising taxation or printing money. Can these fix crises like this? In a word, no. Printing money, quantitative easing, or modern monetary theory are all solutions within the capitalist economic system, but do nothing to solve the root problems that cause crises. Free market, laissez-faire capitalism led to the Wall Street crash and World War II. After that, Keynesian spending was tried after World War II, but was abandoned as soon as the USSR collapsed. And this economic spending was actually huge. Most industries in Britain were nationalised after the war because everything was destroyed. And it's not a good economic prospect. It's not attractive to capitalists to come in when there's almost no hope of making money. Hence the bailouts in the more recent economic crises and the government schemes trying to stabilise and rescue the system while all the wealth gets sucked up to this smaller group of billionaires. But these were just SOPs, and while they still exist in a commodity production system, they will be taken away. While commodity production for profit, and in particular monopoly capitalism, dominates, all successive crises will be paid for by the increasing poverty of the working class. And we can see how in almost every country, especially in Western Europe, but also in America, every country that introduced some form of social welfare, social democracy, in the response of either the Great Depression or World War II, all of these provisions have been removed. All of the nationalisation has been privatised. And this is because the commodity production still exists. These billionaires who still essentially direct society, the ruling class, wants to eat away at that. They need to find more and more sources of profit. They need to find new markets, and they need to keep increasing their profits. And there's only two ways they can do that, really. It's by eating up public infrastructure and companies, as they did in Europe after the Keynesian consensus was reached and all those industries were nationalised. They were slowly privatised, which is still ongoing, but it's largely been completed. And they can conquer new markets, whether that's economically or militarily. And there's a real risk of war, which is why they're pouring weapons into Ukraine. They're funding unrest in Serbia, Taiwan. We are at a real crossroads, and there's a real risk of a Third World War breaking out, because that is one of the solutions to this economic crisis. It destroys all the products of overproduction. It kind of kicks economic production into a different gear, because suddenly all the economy is focused on a war economy and is producing more and more for war. And they have to rebuild. There were billions of dollars worth of contracts given out after the invasion of Iraq and the destruction of that country and the massacre of millions of people. Billions of dollars worth of contracts went to American companies who occupied that country for close to 2 decades. Same with Afghanistan. It's American contractors, Western contractors that are going in, having security contracts, having contracts for building stuff, military infrastructure and supplies. They make a huge amount of money off this. And similarly with Ukraine, all of these governments have been purchasing military equipment. So Britain, for example, but also the US and many other Western European governments have been purchasing on a state level military equipment and hardware, as well as aid and other things, and sending it into Ukraine. And now the West is talking about running out of arms and ammunition because they've been shipping it all to Ukraine. This is another way of kind of encouraging economic production of arms and stimulating that asset of the economy as if the arms industry wasn't large enough. In summary, there are a few steps the working class can take to change this. We can organise and go on strike, especially if you're working somewhere that is conducive to the war effort, producing or moving munitions, producing or distributing propaganda. The threat of the war is very real and coming up. So we encourage all workers to get organised in a union and encourage within your union workers to discuss these political issues and organise and stand up against them. We should be demanding higher wages, which necessarily means lower profits. But as we've seen, there's been a massive transfer of wealth, not just over the past few years, but especially over the past couple of years, a massive transfer of wealth from the rest of society into the hands of a tiny minority of individuals, that something like 30% almost, billionaires getting richer within a 3-month period during the start of the coronavirus. It's not an accident, that's how the system works. But obviously if we're transferring all of the wealth of society into the hands of individuals and then complaining that everyone else doesn't have enough money to pay for heating or buy necessities, it speaks very clearly to a very broken system. We should demand nationalisation of companies that cannot be run on this basis by capitalism. We should realise that these measures cannot be accepted by capitalism. So there's a reason that social democracy has failed. There's a reason that the Keynesian consensus was ended, companies were privatised, social welfare has been eaten away. It's because under capitalism, as I said, they cannot accept that and they must find more and more source of profit, which comes out of our pockets. Labour and social democracy in general has betrayed the cause of labour for 100 years, from World War I to the general strike of 1926, through to the miners' strike and up to the present day. And it's abundantly clear that the Labour Party has neither an economic nor political solution, but offers more of the same: austerity and war. While we're striking for these measures, we need to raise consciousness of workers that a new form of party and a new form of struggle is necessary, that we must abolish the wages system, that wealth, industry, land, productive resources can be confiscated from the parasitic class and used for the satisfaction of the material needs of the mass of the working people. This, and not minor tinkering with capitalism, is the true meaning of socialism. Socialism is in the interests of the masses of the working class of Britain and must become our united rallying cry. No other solution for our problems can be found. So, comrades, I urge you to join us in this.